Let's try that again. Glad you're here to be a part of the webinar this morning. I'm Lana Shope, and I am the project director for the CARES project at the partnership. And we are very happy to have our guest do the third of their 3 webinars for us today. We've been in partnership with US Digital Response, and they have tapped into their more than 6,000 volunteers to do webinars for our network so that we can increase our skills and knowledge. And today I'm thrilled that we're going to be talking about remote processes as we do programs within the network. And we have 4 great presenters with us today: Alex Elaine, Steve Barlow, Zane Zelkirk, and Triana Komanoff. And they will be presenting the information for you today. Next slide, please. As is our common practice with the partnership, we take just a moment to center ourselves and remember why we're here and why we do what we do. Our promise is important to our work, and it's a great tool for us as we prepare for the learning that is about to happen. Community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicating to helping people help themselves and each other. For those of you out there who are CCAPs, you probably have that memorized. And those of you who've been in the network for a while probably have it memorized too. It's a great reminder of who we are and what we do. And with that, I will turn it over to US Digital Response.
Thanks for having us. Well, hi everyone. My name is Alex Elaine. I am one of the co-founders and CTO of US Digital Response, and we're going to talk about digitizing workflows and a project we did in partnership with Steve at Neighborhood Preservation, Inc. Next slide, please. All right, so just a real brief, what are we going to do? So I will tell you a little bit about US Digital Response. We'll do an overview of digitizing processes, how to think about that approach. So we're going to have a case study, and importantly, we're going to have a Q&A at the end, but please drop any of your questions in the chat kind of throughout the process, and we'll make sure to cover them when the time is right. So US Digital Response is a new organization. We started in March of 2020 when a group of technologists and folks with previous government experience came together and said, this is going to be a really big problem. The folks in government were already hearing from their friends who are still who had been in government. We're hearing from their friends about how challenging the situation already was becoming back in March, before it had been an entire year slog. And a lot of technologists just wanted to know how to help. And so the way we kind of talk about ourselves is we are a group that connects pro bono technologists to governments and organizations where we can leverage technology expertise to serve the public in a time of crisis. We are fast, we're free, and we don't have an agenda. We're completely nonpartisan as well. So the way we work is really heavily predicated on adapting to the needs of the folks we're working with. And we do that by bringing in, first of all, highly skilled technologists. So our volunteers are folks who are experienced in industry. They aren't going to make the beginner mistakes. They've already made those mistakes. They have their sea legs. And they have a lot of expertise in their domains, which means they're able to move really fast. Which is really important because we need to operate at the speed of need, which in a crisis can be, hours, not days. We also take an approach that is very demand-driven. We want to understand the problem from the perspective of the government or organization that we're working with, and we're not trying to push a technology agenda. We will work within the tech stack that is already there with the expertise of the team that is there to figure out how can we bring our perspectives and experiences to bear on what is probably a very thorny problem that technology will only be one part of solving, but technology can play a useful role. And so we try to bring that perspective, knowing that our partners have the real expertise But by leveraging what we know, sometimes we can come to better solutions together. And then we do try to find common patterns and then scale up those examples so that we can use them elsewhere rather than just everything being kind of in individual silos. And so a lot of the rest of this presentation is actually going to talk through some of kind of a little bit of actually how we work, because it'll be an example of the U.S. digital response approach to. So let's head to the next slide. So just to give you a sense, we've done a lot of work in the last year. So almost 300 projects with governments and nonprofits, kind of evenly split across different types of partners. We've worked across a large portion of the United States. If you all know anyone in any of the gray states on the map, we'd love to work with them as well. And we've deployed, when I joined back in March, we had 350 volunteers, and I thought that was a huge number of people and we would never need any more. And it's turned out we've doubled that number in terms of just deployed volunteers, and our database is close to 7,000 now, which is pretty awesome. And one of the things we realized pretty early on was that COVID obviously is a health crisis of enormous proportion, but it is also magnifies many pre-existing problems and challenges. And so it has become a housing crisis. It's become an economic crisis. It became a challenge during the election for election offices to operate in a totally different way. And so our work has moved from being not just about health, but actually about quite a wide range of needs that people have. So we're going to talk more specifically in this presentation about digitized workflows. And really what we're talking about for digitized workflows is taking processes that might have previously been in person or on paper and translating them to be online, computer-based, so they can be done remotely. Next slide. So obviously COVID-19 has pretty heavily shifted the way we worked. A lot of things that work just fine on paper in an in-person environment, when you can't go in person, or it's really difficult to be in person, it takes a lot of effort to stay safe, it just changes the nature of how we operate. And of course, it's also changed the way that we engage with each other. Next slide, please. Things that we could go to an office or have a meeting. We're all here, in a webinar today instead of being in a room together. Next slide, please. And so this has become the new norm. Overnight, we got people had to shift. And so early on, USDR started getting actually quite a number of requests for help with making this transition. In fact, a lot of the work that we have done have incorporated some form of digitizing a process. We have a few examples here. One kind of about how we gather is this local arts festival for a city in California. It was a major part of their culture. It was always in person. They'd been doing it for I think about 30 years, and they were going to cancel this year. And we worked with them to help bring it into an online forum. It obviously changed the nature of the way the arts festival worked, but it was really successful. It went over 30 days instead of just being an in-person one kind of day event. It was we helped them think through, how do we not just move something online, but actually think about how to take advantage of the online experience to bring new aspects to it. Next slide, please. So go a little bit deeper into another example of many. So one of the things that we did this year was a bunch of work helping election offices around the country move from voting is obviously an in-person activity in much of the country, but we knew that absentee voting was going to be an issue, but also poll workers. As you probably know, many poll workers have been poll workers for years and years, which means that a lot of them were in the at-risk age range. And Harris County was really worried, where are they going to find enough people to staff the polls? And so they came up with this innovative idea of doing using student poll workers from their high schools. But they didn't really have a process for accepting applications at the scale they needed. It would be really tough to do this all on paper. And so we worked with them to put together an entire poll worker management process. It was built on Airtable, had an application form. It had a consent form for the guardians of these students. So somebody could apply, it would automatically send their parents or their guardian a consent form, and they would actually help them manage like staffing polling locations and where people would actually go. And so that saved them, thousands of minutes, hundreds of hours, and allowed them to very smoothly run the election. They actually won an award from the Election Assistance Commission recently, a Cleary, for their student poll worker work, which is really impressive. So let's talk a little bit about digitizing processes. I think you've all probably been doing this in the last year, but if somebody comes and says we need to digitize this process, going from kind of a maybe a paper-based process or or something that's been more in person, step one is not just convert the existing process to a digital form. It's really start by understanding the challenge that you're facing and the problem that you are trying to solve. This creates a lot more opportunity for bringing the best of technology into the problem space without maybe encoding pre-existing inefficiencies that the technology can really help solve. And really, the key here is once you have that problem well defined, you still have to understand the existing process. You can't, even if you're not going to replicate it 100%, you have to know it's there because it gives you all the constraints for what you got to do. And so really understanding, okay, this is how it works today. These are the reasons it works this way. The second part is understanding the users. Anytime a process is being kind of overhauled or digitized, is a great opportunity to put the user at the center of the process, understand what they're actually trying to accomplish. And that's both the users, maybe if it's an application process, you have multiple sets of users. You have the users who are on the, who are filling out, say, your application in this particular case, but also the people who are responding to the applications and maybe screening them or reviewing them. And so there may be multiple personas here, and you want to understand all of them and what their needs are so that you can take that into account as you're building the system. And then as you're thinking about the process, this gives you an opportunity to figure out where technology is best leveraged and where human capabilities are best leveraged. So sometimes processes that are being digitized, they're great opportunities to automate work that is just very tedious or manual that people don't need. A good example of that is anytime you might be validating data. If it's a paper form, it's really hard to validate data. If it's on a computer, that can be quite quick. And so you can actually remove large steps of human time from that process. On the other hand, there are some places where it's actually quite a lot of work to digitize something, and it may even be better for a human to continue doing it or even add a human step because it's just too hard to do it on a computer. If you're, for example, if you have a step that involves human judgment, or where human judgment might be very useful, it may be better to continue to have a human in the loop rather than trying to run a really complex calculation that's very fuzzy with a computer algorithm. One nice thing when you do this is you're usually now optimizing for what humans are good at, for them to be doing, and what computers are good at, you can have computers do, rather than having everything kind of falling onto humans who might be good at some things and not good at other things in the previous process. You can really, both sides can be much better off. And then finally, when you're working on this kind of process, it's really important to think about sustainability from the beginning. And this is for two reasons. One reason is that no process is going to be perfect. No matter how much work you put into it, there probably will be changes when it makes contact for the first time with users. They're going to have things they didn't think about. You're going to have things that you didn't expect. And so it's really important to take an incremental and iterative approach to any kind of change like this, so that you're able to test ideas and then adapt them. And that means having software and tools that allow you to do that rather than coming with a very baked in upfront opinion of exactly how things should work. And if it's too inflexible, it will be really hard to make it work for what you need. The second part of this is, and by the way, even once it's working really well, it might change later too. And so you want to make sure that you and your team are capable of making those little adjustments throughout the process. So it's very difficult to just rely on somebody to come in. So when we work USDR, we always think about this from the beginning of how can we ensure that we are working with technologies that our partners will be able to modify and adapt rather than needing to rely on us, since volunteers do have shelf lives. The other part of it is just that things will break. All software tends to have bugs and surprises that come up, and so it also needs to be you need to know who to call when something is not working. And so thinking about that up front, what happens when it doesn't work, and making sure that you know the right people who can debug and fix quickly. So sustainability has to be brought into the beginning because it affects tool choice, and affects, in some cases, even how you might build the process to make it a little bit more robust to change in the future. Even though we have it kind of at the end, it permeates everything we do. Okay, so I think we are going to dive into a case study now. So I'm going to hand it off to the other panelists.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming today. I have to shout out to my Shelby County friend, Stephanie Duckett. Glad you're here today. Shelby County Community Services Agency and the Shelby County Division of Community Services is a member of this association, and also has been a partner with the City of Memphis in the CARES Act dollars distribution and in the emergency rent assistance program rollout that Neighborhood Preservation Inc. has been a program partner on. I'm Steve Barlow. I'm president of Neighborhood Preservation Incorporated. We're a Memphis-based nonprofit that started about 10 years ago, mostly focusing on blighted property challenges. But over the years, we've become very active in many policy issues, including blight prevention. One of the things you can do to prevent blighted neighborhoods from happening is to get sort of on the front end and the prevention side, where we actually are taking steps to avoid houses and apartment buildings being deteriorated in their condition or vacated. In the city of Memphis, we have a very high poverty rate. We have a very large geographic area, about 300 square miles, twice the size physically of the city of Detroit, for example. And our population is relatively low for that size footprint, in the 600,000 to 700,000 range. And we have, as I said, a very high poverty. So that means we have a lot of housing needs. And the housing needs tie closely to the policy of housing and the policy of finance and the policy of neighborhood planning, and that is the sort of the nexus of, why is a neighborhood advocacy group getting involved in evictions and working with the government. It's because we're dealing with the systemic challenges in partnership with our government agencies. So the COVID-19 opportunity that was presented with the funds for COVID-19 was to deal with this very large concern of evictions across the country. But as you'll see here, there were a lot of warnings about what would happen when the courts opened back up. So I've had that conversation with many people. I'm sure you have too in your community. What are we going to do to help people stay stable, to make them safe, and to make the rest of us safe from people not having a place to live in a pandemic environment? So this has been a big challenge for our community, as it has been for many others. pre-COVID, Memphis was looking at about 30,000 evictions a year. Some of those are duplicates, happen more than once. Not all eviction filings result in someone actually, being set out of their house. Sometimes they're done as a last resort, and it results in somebody paying up and staying. But we have a big churn of evictions in our community. So the eviction settlement program was our CARES Act funded response to the eviction crisis in the Memphis and Shelby County environment. Memphis and Shelby County CARES Act funds were combined. We had a $1.4 million allocation to spend on eviction settlement. Our goal was to intervene at the point of an eviction, to check to see if somebody was actually facing an eviction, and then to give them the opportunity to apply for some financial assistance that would result in their eviction being dismissed. So the settlement program here, you'll see in these 4 steps, one of the first things that we wanted to do in terms of an automated process flow, which is a new word for me. I only learned that after I met these fine people on the call today. I didn't know what I was asking for. We'll talk more about that later. I just knew that we needed a robust technological solution so that I wouldn't have the limited number of people I had working on the program working around the clock, digging through paperwork and trying to find where that application that Ms. Smith gave me 2 weeks ago is. So we worked on these steps. And what we needed was this streamlined workflow. And so we were moving from a manual process in many cases, because, for example, when we first launched our eviction settlement program, it was before we were connected, or at the same time as we were first meeting USDR. We had some digital tools, but we were doing everything tenant by tenant, application by application, eviction by eviction. We didn't have any streamlined thing, and we had this urgency of court cases coming up where we wanted to prevent people from being set out, and we had money to spend, and we wanted to connect the money to the people as quickly as possible. So we just had too much information for the limited number of humans that we had involved to manage. And I think at this point, Zane will take over a little bit, but Triana and I will continue to stay connected. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Zane. I work with USDR as a volunteer. This project, working with Steve, was my first sort of on-ramp to USDR. I have about 15 years of experience in the technology sector. A lot of that time sort of being the conduit between technologists and businesses, and the other chunk of time focusing on sort of technology strategy, business strategy, and operations. And that combination turned out to be a good fit for MPI. As I was onboarded, basically the context that I had was that there was an organization that knew that they were at sort of a moment of needing to scale, and that they had some kind of limitation on their capacity to support this sort of application process and intake process, but didn't know a lot more than that. So I was brought in, and a lot of sort of the sort of nature of one of these projects, I think Alex covered really well. But as somebody who knows nothing about the field, partnered with an organization who doesn't necessarily have the technological background, means that there is an initial phase that's, pretty heavy lift of the technologists sort of learning about the organization and just understanding what the process looks like today, trying to sort of divorce that from any presumptions around the specific role that technology will play. It's really just a phase of learning. And so with this, a few things started to come out, in conversations with Steve and those on his team. It became clear that they had sort of the foundation set up that had enabled them to actually get the program up and running. But a lot of those things were very brittle, or just simply didn't scale well. Things were happening literally on paper, or their initial application didn't collect a significant portion of the information that they actually needed in order to fulfill an application and put an applicant into the process. There were a number of different software systems that they were using, none of which actually talked to each other, which meant that a lot of information was getting duplicated across systems. And a lot of that duplication was happening manually, so there was also a lot of room for error. And so essentially sort of at every point it became clear over these conversations that there were opportunities both to sort of adjust the process and sort of refocus what the folks at various points were doing, and also insert sort of little bits of technology along the way. And again, so basically, you know, there is a balance to strike between sort of completely reimagining what Steve was working with and sort of trying to make his life easier. And so our focus from a technology standpoint is both reimagining, but also kind of building enough foundational elements that we can begin that iterative process of change that Alex talked about. So it was clear that the end goal was not crystal clear, and that in itself was clarifying, in that we knew that we needed to build something that was flexible so that we could make changes for Steve, understand how his team was able to work with those, and then continue to adjust them over time to ensure that we ended up in a place and were able to continue to evolve to a place that was actually most impactful and most useful for him. So let's keep moving. So some specifics in this case, I'd mentioned, one example is the very first touch point of these applications initially had been a Google form. It's something that was very easy for Steve's team to set up and get moving with. But on the Google form, applicants couldn't upload documents. So already that was requiring at least one phone call between one of his clerks and sort of actually reaching an applicant and then collecting that, often via email. So we changed the intake form and used a third-party technology that was easy for us to set up, didn't require necessarily engineers to set up, so would be sustainable long-term for Steve to own. An organization called JotForm is a great survey tool, and it allows uploads. It allowed a digital signature, so we no longer needed to actually go out again separately to each applicant and request a signature and request a sworn affidavit. We could do that in line. And that meant that after each applicant went through the process, there was a sort of tidy folder and a tidy home for each applicant that Steve's clerks could access. And all of that lived in one place. Additionally, there were, I'd mentioned there were sort of several software touch points that were built into his process that were necessary components based on his organization's workflow and those organizations that he partners with. And that meant that there were signatures that were required that we couldn't collect up front. And so we also leveraged DocuSign and eventually another digital signature provider. DocuSign plugged in both to JotForm and also to the legal software that Steve was already using. So a lot of this was about finding third-party software that was plug and play. So Steve, again, could continue to own this longer term, but that enabled, basically connected necessary touch points that were already fundamental to his process that we didn't necessarily want to change. And one of the pieces of software that we used a lot to make those connections is something called Zapier, which is, has its ups and downs. Sometimes it can be really frustrating, but it's also a really powerful tool that enables you to oftentimes connect software that you already use to software that you might be a little bit less familiar with. And it sort of creates a pipe that otherwise, in most situations, you might actually need a team of engineers to build for you. All right, so just moving on a little bit in terms of sort of finding this balance, what this really looked like at the other end is that, again, we sort of had this automated input. Everything was able to live in a single folder for Steve's team. We were able to upload all of that information that otherwise sort of would have gotten stuck between an email inbox and Google Drive and legal software, and upload that all into Clio, if you're familiar, which is legal software, and also pull out parts of that were critical for a second type of legal software that Steve was already using called Kemps, and just pull out the information that needed to be loaded into Kemps and provide that sort of in a much more pared down way and targeted way to the team that was actually using that data. Previously, it was sort of all or nothing. Everybody had to sift through absolutely everything that came in from an applicant. But using these tools, we were able to essentially create focus for his folks. And I think one of the biggest things that Steve talked about as we did this was sort of saving that time and saving his team from simply managing the paperwork meant that his team was actually able to spend those minutes that they were able to get a client on the phone, developing the relationship and sort of getting buy-in, which in turn enabled his clients to actually more productively engage with the program. So it was less transactional and much more personal. Yeah, and so I think, you know, the big learning here, perhaps for both of us, was that, you know, I think each, both USDR and NPI were able to sort of build solutions together in a collaborative way that were flexible and sort of intentionally meant to evolve. Because there was flexibility on Steve's end, it meant that he was able to work with his clerks to actually change the nature of the work that they were doing, which in turn enabled us to plug in technological solutions that could enable them sort of bigger picture to actually tackle and support many more applicants and many more cases. And it was a two-way learning process. Steve was learning a lot about the technology while it was sort of a fire hose on my end of learning about how how both his organization worked as well as how the clients sort of like to interact with the organization. And all of this was essentially about sort of finding a middle ground where we could, you know, have as great of an impact as we could on Steve's organization while sort of, in the positive sense, without having to reconstruct too much of how they already did business. I think we've covered most of this. I think the idea behind this was just sort of in that learning process. You know, I think probably all of you are very familiar with the incredible complexity that often gets built into these organizations when you're understaffed. You get incredibly creative and you can get so much done. But as an outsider, when you step into these into an organization like this, you begin to recognize the amount of complexity that humans are actually managing. And so a lot of USDR is about sort of being able to observe this from the outside and offer a fresh perspective on how to simplify that. And to Alex's point earlier, you know, identify the parts of that really are best for humans to handle, and which of those you can reduce complexity on by creating a more elegant technical solution for.
I'd like to comment on that too. You know, I think that's the first time I've seen that manual drawing there. But the complexity of the challenge for us is magnified as a nonprofit in a government, working with a government agency to deploy a complex, expensive new program quickly. Because we don't know the questions to ask, and I'm not a process expert. You know, I know how to interact with the community. I know what people need. I know what requirements I have to meet government funding guidelines and nonprofit regulations. You know, and I know how to play the politics of it, all that stuff. But you know, like so just to reiterate what I said, we didn't really know what we were asking for. But what we needed that USDR was uniquely poised to provide was somebody to talk to about what we needed. And I was surprised. I was shocked how cheap some of the software solutions that Zane and Alex recommended were. I was shocked at how quickly they, with their process and technology minds, were able to help me solve challenges that I didn't really have a staff member or a team member who was focused on. And so, you know, I've learned a lot, as Zane said, about how to, you know, ask some of these questions as early as possible in the process. I've worked with process mappers before, and many of you probably have as well. But it's another thing for me, at least it was for me, to actually work work on, quickly converting from sort of existing process to new process to tech of new process and a flow that had automation. And when Zane first told me what do we need to put human eyeballs on, it was sort of a foreign term to me to think about it that way. But now it's a very natural thing to think about in our current programs. What do we and what don't we need that thoughtful analysis on.
Steve, do you want to talk a little bit on the impact front?
Sure. Yeah, the initial challenge, as Zane said, was reaching people and people reaching us, and we were trying to match up attorneys with the people facing evictions as quickly as possible, get access to all the data that would connect everybody. And so we were able to really, in the end, provide. This was actually, it actually ended up being almost 1,500 people who got assistance, 1,155 households, so that means 4,000 people. And we had a significant reduction in the time that clerks spent per application, from like an hour or 45 minutes each to like, as little as 5 to 10 minutes each. And the time spent was more relational and less transactional and collecting information that was easy to collect on a form. And so, as I told you at the beginning, we were budgeted with 1.4 million, but we ended up in the end spending almost 1.8 million because there was additional CARES Act dollars to be spent, and we had people lined up ready to pay if we got more money. And so we were able to, because of our process and our system that we'd built, we were able to actually help the city and county spend more money down before the deadline, which was originally the end of 2020. So this was a miracle to me, and I kept telling Alex and Triana and Zane that this, it just really feels like magic. It's just unbelievable that we can put a form out there, and just by the submission of a form, the processes that we got done, the signed forms, fully executed agreements, filed in the right place. One of the so we know there's a better way to solve these challenges than we were doing. And I think we next get into a little bit about how that laid a foundation. Yeah, so it's a foundation for future work. So the 1.8 million that we spent, that was a lot of money and saved a lot of households from evictions in 2020, turned into this massive allocation of federal dollars. And so the city and the county decided to put their $28 million together to build a new program that was on the foundation of the work we did in the fall.
Yeah, one of the neat things about this, I say neat, but also I'm sure from an organizational perspective is sort of difficult, but from a solutions perspective is fun, is how much this has continued to evolve. So I think we started working together, Steve, in the end of July, maybe. And I would call what we're doing now in April essentially an extension of that work. The first iteration of that went live in a few weeks. And then Triana joined us in the fall to build another extension. Do you want to talk a little bit about the work that you were working on in the fall, and then how that's evolved this winter, Triana?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so my role in this project was on two separate pieces, not necessarily the intake, but on one, which was tracking which folks that had applied for assistance actually filled out the CDC eviction moratorium letter, which, for those of you who don't know, would actually protect against evictions theoretically. And the other part was matching the folks that had applied for eviction assistance with pro bono attorneys. And so both of those were separate from the intake process, but very much involved in the whole workflow of trying to make sure that the clients were actually being met with the assistance that they needed. And the reason Zane brought up the sustainability and sort of iterative nature of this is because all of those changed very much over the course of the few months that we've been working on it. So in terms of the actual eviction moratorium, that has been extended and changed a couple of times since that came out. And so one of the things that we did was partner with a organization that I now work for called A2J Tech that has created COVID-19 evictionforums.com, which is a free resource for anyone to fill out basically a form that will generate the letter. And so rather than reinventing the wheel, we just asked them to make some customizations for us, and they did so for free. And we've been able to hook that into our process. And so now for everybody that applies, we check to see whether or not they filled out that letter, that form, and we'll add it to their file. And the other part of this, which was the matching process with the pro bono attorneys, has involved a lot of changes in terms of how that's conducted, how we collect who the attorneys are that are able to give their time, how we make sure that they're still able to give time for the particular week that we need their help, how we prioritize which clients are coming in that are being evicted today or tomorrow versus later in the month, and that has been a very iterative process as well.
Thanks. And part of what Triana was talking about at the end there is tying into the latest funding that Steve has referenced a few times, which I think because of the collaboration that we had success on this fall, that funding, even more funding came our way. Steve had a sort of new vision for this second round of funding or this bigger round of funding, which meant that we essentially reinvented the program from a technical standpoint as well. But similar to what he had mentioned earlier, and I think all of us have brought up at this point, is you don't always know the requirements up front. A lot of these programs, you hear that, oh, it's under consideration in the government. Okay, it passed, but we don't have any details. Okay, we're starting to get details, but and those continue to evolve over time. So there's only so much that you can do up front, and then there's a lot of gaps that you need to fill in as they happen. And so with this latest round of funding, Steve's organization is spearheading a pretty innovative way of dispersing that, which meant that from a technical perspective, we're sort of starting over essentially earlier this year. But the neat thing is that we've also worked with him to sort of make that first round of grants so that it could get out the door, get the program up and running. But we use those first weeks essentially as kind of a learning for us all. And because of sort of Steve's openness in terms of this collaboration, it's meant that we essentially relaunched all of the technical systems so that it can be sustainable longer term. But that required everybody to kind of take a leap of faith for the initial rollout earlier this year and say, okay, we'll get as much as we can up and running so that we can start to learn, understanding that it will be bumpy, understanding that we won't have fixed everything up front. But as we learn, we can start filling those gaps. And as there are sort of bigger chunks that we recognize sort of require rethinking, we can do those in partnership and make sure that Steve's team is up to speed and understands and has the training they need, and the technical systems are there sort of meeting the needs on that end all the way along.
One thing to add, I don't want to cut you off.
Please,
one thing to add is with this huge new federal program, lots of out-of-the-box solutions started popping up, and it becomes kind of a thorny issue, honestly, from the government and nonprofit sector side of things. We started at the same time as we already had USDR working to help us solve locally with a customized solution for a customized program for the emergency rental assistance. There were out-of-the-box solutions being prepared and promoted and marketed, and so it becomes this sort of a funny. Anyway, my point in saying that is that a customized locally, local solution is different from an out-of-the-box national sort of a across the board vanilla solution, and so that's a challenge, first of all, because it's really hard and takes a lot of time to create a customized solution, and but there are these strengths and weaknesses to both, And I don't know if we'll get to that today, but it's something that has become a pretty important conversation. And what I've loved about USDR's response to that is, you know, they're a group of volunteers and they don't have anything to gain from their work on it, so they can objectively guide us on the best approach. If an off the shelf or out of the box tech solution is what we need, they would, I think, say that. And if we can do better with something customized with their help or with other people's help, you know, they're going to also give us that advice. So that's one of the things I've really appreciated and has made a big difference for us.
All right. So that sort of wraps up our case study. Just to summarize some of the learnings that you've heard here today. I think a lot of this sort of upfront is both from sort of the technology perspective as well as an organization's perspective, trying to step back and get out of sort of the cram of the day-to-day to really understand what that higher level process is like. What are you actually solving for? I think Alex had mentioned in the beginning, USDR's approach is not purely to replace sort of human process with technology process, but to actually step back and think about what works best. What are the needs? What are the key goals of the engagement? And part of that is collaborating between the technology and the organization, ensuring that there are going to be changes on both sides. And if you do make a technological change, it's going to have an impact to the organization. And obviously you want the impact to be a positive one, but sometimes introducing technology is actually the wrong path. And so that needs to be sort of a back and forth conversation to find those places where technology can have a purely positive impact, or a more purely positive impact. Yeah, and Steve had just brought up sort of the idea of an out-of-the-box solution. With USDR and with a lot of our engagements to date, this varies a little bit, but in many circumstances, we are sort of working against the clock. And so we have been able to leverage on our end a balance between using our own volunteer technology folks or just buying things off the shelf where we know we can plug and play. So whether or not an organization is doing that sort of off the shelf purchase themselves, or partnering with us to help them think through it and identify the best spots for those, sometimes that really is the best way forward, and something custom is unnecessary for one reason or another. I think that's sort of a good summary of where we've ended up. Is anybody, any other panelists want to jump in on any of the learnings?
Just one thing to, oh, sorry. Someone else. Okay. One thing that I just wanted to reiterate was the fact that it's not always a technological solution that we recommended. It sometimes was, we're going to, take technology this far, and then the rest of it will be manual because, a person would be able to do it better. Maybe the volume doesn't equate the value in terms of the time that it would cost to create a custom technology solution. And so it really was a team effort from both NPI side and USDR side to really find out, where does the person have to be? Where would it be best to have a person, and where does the technology really do the heavy lifting? And so this last slide is really just to show the different processes from, first identifying the challenge, finding the technology that is the most useful for that particular situation, whether it's off the shelf or whether or not something that needs to be developed in-house, and how to really build it in such a way that is both affordable and sustainable, both for, the partner NPI in this case, and making sure that that's something that they can bring forwards. And especially, I know Alex was mentioning before that these are solutions that we like to build in USDR to be recyclable, so that we can build something for one project and use them in another project. That these are issues that have come up that are in Memphis and Shelby County, but that are popping up across the country for various other programs as well.
Great. So I think at this point we'll take some questions, and then we can close with how to get in touch with you. Does that sound okay? Or do you want to do that first? We can do that first and take questions after.
Sure. Yeah. Just briefly, we're here to help. We work on problems of, if you have a specific problem, we're happy to hear that. If you need some help sorting through exactly what the problem is, kind of as Steve described earlier, we're happy to work through something that's ambiguous or thorny and talk through and identify where we might be able to help. So don't hold back. If you've got something you're not quite sure it's a good fit, ask us, and part of our job is to help figure out the right shape for things that are a good fit and work with you on that. So it's real easy to get in touch with us. We have a web form at usdigitalresponse.org/request-help, and we'll get back to you within about 24 hours. So please feel free to reach out.
Great. And I just put in the chat, I want to remind everyone, these experts are free. We had a specific example today about rental assistance, but we know many of you are facing other issues related to providing services in our current environment as we're in the stage of recovery and response and recovery. So if you would take just a moment and put in the chat an area in your agency, an area of work where you feel this technology would be helpful. And while you're doing that, I'm going to go back up to a couple of questions that we had. One was, what is the legal software being used?
I'll jump in on that, and Steve, please chime in. So the short answer to that is Clio and Kemp's. Not sure if you've heard of those two. My understanding is that they're pretty mainstream legal case management softwares. USDR didn't have a hand in selecting those, but those sort of came to us as software that was already in use by Steve's organization and his partner organizations. So that came to us as a requirement of, if our limitation is that we need to use not only one of these, but both of these, and that we need a lot of the same information in both, what's the best way that we can make that happen to sort of reduce duplication of effort, essentially.
I'll add one thing,
Okay.
which is that the Clio law legal services management software tool, it's a pretty good online hourly billing and client creation and matter management software. What we were doing was creating a new client and then creating a new matter and then uploading documents to that software manually by a single person who collected that information from an applicant. What we did at the end of the day was, based upon the submission of a form in JotForm using Zapier, Clio, an automatic, the client was created automatically, the matter within that client was created automatically, and the documents we needed, including the CDC letter that was signed by the tenant, were all filed in the Clio the documents section. And so all we had to do was get our volunteer attorneys an account in Clio, and they could log in and find everything they needed to handle a person's case. That went from being something that we would have spent hours and hours on to something that happened automatically, so the attorneys and the clerks could just focus on the actual work. But Clio, some legal services softwares couldn't have handled that, and Clio could, so that was the reason that we went with that.
One thing that's a non sequitur, but I feel like is worth calling out here, is that even over the sort of 8 months, I guess it is now, of this engagement, a lot of the software that we've used is actually dramatically evolved, and that's kind of the beautiful thing about software, whether you built something in-house or whether you're using something off the shelf. Like we mentioned, we use JotForm. JotForm today can actually support even more of what we want to do than it did 8 months ago. And so there are some things, for example, that we're using Zapier for, back in August that now are already built into some of these tools. And so that's just sort of a reminder that sometimes when you are using these things off the shelf, a lot comes for free, and a lot of the frustration points that you have are shared by other organizations. So the more that you do use shared solutions, the more likely it is that something that you really want will get built, because you're not the only person who needs it. So just wanted to mention that.
Okay, I have a couple of comments asking if you could put, let's see, could you put some of the tools names in the chat? So if anyone on the team could do
I did.
that. Oh, fabulous. Okay. And then I have another question here. We serve a very rural area in eastern Idaho, and there are a lot of miles between towns. Digitizing processes allows us to open up program availability for rural residents and provides them with a stronger case management aid to involve them in a whole family approach. This is a very exciting option to explore. Oh, there's some motivation for all of us. I have an example for you. A small rural community action agency has food pantries in their at least one in each of their 7 counties. And they're needing a system that can keep track of the food that goes out to individuals who may come in to get the food or maybe request a food delivery. They need to be able to track what goes out with what is donated. So let's say a grocery store donates 12 cases of green beans. They need to be able to document where those 12 cases of green beans go. Now, it doesn't work to do that on a tick sheet where you write a mark for every can. Is there a way that that could all be put through a digital system that could do that tracking for them?
I think the short answer is yes. I think it will, greatly depend on the details of your system and especially, who needs to know what at what time, where the information is going to and coming from. And I think those are all, the first step of the process, like we mentioned before, is, looking at the whole system, the flow of the process, where the information is coming from, and making sure that, you understand every step of the way so that, is this something that's going to fall through the cracks, or is this going to get caught in a bottleneck, and understanding that first before replacing everything with technology. But I think that's definitely something that could be tracked.
Okay, great. All right. Here's another question. How do you suggest making forms, applications, etc., more accessible for, I can't read it, my eyes are too bad, varying languages and may have limited formal education?
So Steve, I think we've sort of discussed some of this as a part of the project, so I can answer some, and of course, please jump in as well. But I'd say, again, off-the-shelf solutions for the win. In our case, Steve was hoping to be able to offer services in Spanish for Spanish speakers. And the nice thing about JotForm is that it has a translation capability built in really seamlessly to the tool. So in terms of just like core sort of language management, a lot of software solutions do, both off the shelf and custom built, do have the capability of displaying whatever it is in different languages, depending on a user's preferences. In terms of other types of accessibility, one of the things Steve and I explored a bit was things such as, doing a text-based application form where, one thing we did implement was enabling people to text a short code to a specific number, which presented them with a link directly back to the form, which they could then fill out on a phone. meaning people aren't then required to type in an extended URL into their browser or learn how to search for something in a browser. One thing that we explored but decided against pursuing is similarly requires access to a phone, but if you have a phone, doing a single question kind of response flow where you send a message to a specific number and it begins asking you questions one by one. So instead of having to actually type into a form, figure out how to sort of interface with a completely, an extensive form, which may be a little intimidating. There is a service that may even sound like a human that is asking questions like, can you tell me your first name? Can you tell me where you live? Can you take a picture now with your phone of your lease or whatever it is? So those types of things can make the experience feel more accessible. And I would say this is where there would need to be a pretty critical conversation between whoever may be assisting you with technology and sort of the core of your organization around which of those touch points may make your service feel or actually be more accessible to the clients you're hoping to assist. So if your asylees are reticent about technology or don't have access to a phone, what does that mean about where technology can support you? Is then maybe the technology is primarily supporting humans that are sitting within the organization as opposed to replacing them in certain ways. So I think that's where the balance and the conversation comes around the process and understanding who your clients are and sort of where everybody best plugs in.
Can I just add a little bit on top of that?
Yes.
I think there are a few other things. I think that was a great summary. A few just elements I'd add on top of that. One is don't make assumptions when you can avoid it. If you can actually watch some of your users actually using the software, it can be incredibly illuminating. It doesn't take a lot of people to get insights about where blockers might be. If you can even get a handful of folks who are willing to let you observe them using the form, trying to fill it out, seeing where they get stuck, that can be really helpful. A second thing that I think can be really powerful and helps everyone, not just people with limited education, is really trying to keep the amount of text and the number of questions as minimal as possible. If you have really long blocks of text, folks who are not as used to reading long blocks of text are probably going to skip them. It's going to be intimidating. So if you can really keep it to the essentials that help people make the right decisions. And then similarly for the number of questions, the more questions you have, if there's a reason for them to be there, that's great. Of course, you need to have them, but trying to make sure that there is really a great reason for it to be there and not because it might be nice to have that data later. All of those questions become blockers that people need to, might get stuck on. And then actually one thing that the team has done recently in the most recent version of the form is the ability to save it and come back to the form later. And so if somebody isn't super organized with all of their data, they might have started filling out the form, but hit a question like, I need to get a copy of my lease, for example. If you don't have a way to save the form, that can be really tough if you're kind of in the middle of it. And so I think that's another nice improvement that the team used recently. So just a few additional thoughts there.
And then I'll just build on that with, the humans, the people, the team members that we need to go out and be available to help people who are not going to figure out how to fill out a digital application on their own. We can do it on the phone. We can do it in person. We have teams in Memphis and Shelby County now who will show up at your property management office if you're a big apartment building and you want to get your tenants signed up. We have 5 library branches where we have set up tech hubs in case people don't have access to technology in their home, and they can go to the library and have a real live person there help them figure out how to apply. They can either do it themselves on a computer terminal, or they can have somebody help and do it for them. So, finding ways to actually do that outreach, I think, is the only solution to that last step, of getting people who don't have access to technology or don't have the skills to complete a form on their own, but still need the help. So we just have, and so that sort of that last mile delivery takes a lot of human power, but but it's something that that the tech actually, the automated solutions free up people to do that kind of thing. You know, I think we would have less likelihood of having as big of a team of community outreach people as we do if we had less automated flow.
Great, thanks. There was another question about if your folks could help integrate systems, because of course all of our agencies have software systems they use now. In many cases, they're having to double enter because of different software systems. Would US Digital Response be able to find experts to help solve that problem?
I would say generally yes. Alex, I don't know if you have if you want to jump in on that. I don't know what sorts of engagements you may have seen that might be relevant to discuss.
I'm sorry, I got a little bit distracted.
Sorry, I put you on the spot there. There's a question about USDR support of basically an organization that may need help enabling two systems to talk to each other that don't talk to each other today.
Yes, that can be either very easy to do or very, very difficult to do. I would encourage you to reach out through our request help form, and we can help determine whether or not that's something that's within our powers. You know, just to give you a sense, sometimes there are existing APIs or application programming interfaces, ways that software talk to each other that we can help connect, or even tools like Zapier can sometimes might even be using them. So it's a very quick integration. Sometimes those pieces of software may not be set up to talk to one another, in which case it'll be really tough. But we are happy to help you assess whether or not that is in fact the case.
That's good news, because I know a lot of agencies are struggling with that issue because they're spending human capital, human time, putting information into the same computer in two different systems. And, you know, they struggle with justifying that personnel cost, but they have no, you know, they don't know how to do it, can't figure out how to do it another way. So I think that would be tremendously helpful for a lot of community action agencies.
Yeah, one very quick tip there, just searching, taking a look at Zapier, or another tool is Microsoft Power Automate. They do similar things, and seeing if the software you need to connect is supported by either of those tools. Those integrations can then often be very quick. We can also help, but if you're just looking to do a quick sanity check yourself, that would be my kind of an easy suggestion.
Great. All right, I don't see any more questions in the chat. We've had someone offer a common accessibility requirements site. https accessibility.18f.gov. Are you familiar with that? Okay, I will move on to sharing some of our upcoming webinars so that you are aware of what possibilities lie ahead from us on the CARES team. We do have a webinar coming up tomorrow with Melanie Lockwood-Herman on disaster recovery and agency continuity planning. That is number 3 in her 8-part series. Next slide, please. We have a new presenter, Anna Teacup from the Center for Work, Education, and Employment, on talking about the pandemics still going on out there, as we all know, and recovery is in process. But how do we as organizations make sure that recovery is successful from the organizational standpoint? Next slide. And Melanie is doing her 4th webinar on crisis management and crisis communications. That's on May 20th. Next slide. And her 5th series will happen in June. Her 5th webinar in the series will happen in June on the 17th. Next, we have our Equity Summit happening next week. You can see a registration link. You can still register. It's taking place the 19th through the 21st of April. And if you need any additional information, you can contact myself, Ashley Freebert, who's joined the CARES team as a senior associate. Her contact information is there as well. And lots of information on the partnership website. And with that, I'd like to thank our presenters. It was a great webinar. Thank you so much for sharing about this particular experience, but also answering the questions we had about other needs that agencies have regarding getting services up on a digital platform. So thank you, thank you. Don't forget to do the feedback survey so that we can hear from you about how effective this workshop was, this webinar was for you, so that we can continue providing you with what you need as you do the work of helping people and changing lives. So thanks everyone, and special thanks to our presenters. Bye-bye.